Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. I'm Rupert Strachwitz, Vice Chairman. I'm happy to chair our event tonight. I'm really glad to see that we have a large audience. It's Berlin's first and possibly only really nice spring evening, so that you've chosen not to sit in the park but to listen in is really great, and we're very grateful. Special welcome, of course, to Paul Smith, who is the Director of British Council here in Germany, and also the cluster lead for Northwest Europe, whatever that is. Anyway,
don't ask me, Rupert.
Anyway, the man for cultural relations between UK and Germany, and so we're very happy to have you here, Paul, to tell us a bit about all this. Just a few household remarks. This session is recorded, and so if at the end of this you feel you don't want to be in on the recording, please let us know. If you want to join us, and we hope you will, in the discussion, please indicate your comment or question in the chat function, and we will then either read it out or possibly ask you to speak up on your own. Please, if I may ask you, do not use the chat function for messages like hello everybody or hello from Potsdam or something like that, because they tend to sort of fill the chat function and we can't sort of see who else has actually wanted to make a real comment. So with that, over to you, Paul. You've been in Germany now for some years and you know the country well. On the other hand, you've seen lots of other countries in the world and have a sort of global view on the UK, and especially, of course, what the UK will now be able and not able to do as a fully independent country again. So leaving the EU but not leaving Europe has a very special connotation for you. So what you really mean by that, and what we should perhaps mean by that, is the subject of tonight's talk. Thank you very much for doing this, Paul, and over to you. Floor is yours.
So, danke schön, Rupert, danke Marie, and welcome everybody. You really should all be sitting in the park, but the great, on an evening like this, but the virtue of digital is perhaps you are sitting in the park, even while you're just... That's all good. Thank you very much. Yes, the subject is, some of us have been saying for months now, we have left the European Union, Britain that is, but not left Europe. But what does that really mean? Is that just a piece of fanciful statement, or does it have some material content? So since, and I've been here in Germany, incidentally, for about just over 12 months, so this has preoccupied me all the time I've been here through these COVID months. I arrived one day before Germany locked it down. So you can imagine what my experience of Germany has been. So since January 2021, which was the sort of finale of EU exit and the agreement of the trade deal, all of us in diplomacy or in international relations or bilateral relations between the two countries have been absolutely preoccupied with rising to the new challenges that EU exit has given to the bilateral relationship and rising to the new opportunities. Now, let me be frank, as one should be with DBG. Those challenges at the moment are probably more immediate, more obvious, and more imposing than the opportunities. We have a lot of very specific difficulties or tangled scenarios to get through. And the opportunity bit is probably a bit more euphemistic and rhetorical. But the ambition over the coming year, I would suggest, is to reverse that. So that in a year's time, we have diminished the challenges of EU exit as much as we can, and that we are all preoccupied with new opportunities which our new situation yields. Now, I use the word bilateral. And in many ways, the concept of bilateralism pompous word, no doubt. I think you know what I mean. British-German relations in our case, is core to what we're talking about. The UK's relationship with the EU is still important, but is now less important, I would now say, than the way that relationship has translated into newly forged and developed relationships with 27 countries in Europe. And no bilateral relationship, UK relationship with a European country, is more important, and I am sure about this, than the relationship between Britain and Germany. Now, my title is, first of all, talks about leaving the EU and then leaving Europe. Leaving the EU, the challenges and opportunities there are primarily around politics, around international geopolitical relations, around economies, and around trade. This is where the focus of new negotiation and bargaining exists. In the short term, these at least are the agendas, the political and economic agendas of topmost important for intergovernmental and embassy work. But not so much leaving the Europe as leaving the European Union, but leaving Europe. That's a different set of scenarios. Leaving Europe is a cultural concept, cultural in its broadest meaning. The relationships of people to people, the relationships of professions to professions, the relationship of institutions to institutions. Culture covering, of course, yes, the arts and creative industries. That's the first thing we probably think of when we say culture, but culture is a much broader term, we all know that. Culture also covers education at all levels. It covers research, it covers science, the social sciences and humanities and engagement there. It covers our joint commitment to global issues. What issues? Mobility, religious understanding, values and tolerance, climate change, of course, equality, diversity, inclusion. And these bilateral cultural relations are deeply historical, far more than the history of our relationship in the European Union. They make Britain's membership of the EU as a political piece of legacy a tiny blip within the millennium of relationships that Britain has with Europe, including with Germany. Because Germany, we don't just have to think of the political nation which has existed since 1870, 1871. We need to think of Britain's relationship with the Germanic peoples that goes back centuries. It is a cultural concept. And let's think for a moment on the history of that relationship between Britain and Germany. This is going to be a bit of a potted look back. For those of you who know, it's slightly more 1066 and all that than historically spot on. But let's think about in terms of who are the British. How monolithically arrogant are they as an island race? Well, not very, really. Britain has probably been invaded and taken over centuries back, but nevertheless informative centuries, more than, as much as any other country in Europe. We can go back to the 1st century AD. In fact, the 1st century BC and then the 1st century AD, when we were invaded by the Italians. Well, not the Italians, of course, but the Romans. And that was not a minor kind of tangential experience for Britain. Many of our major cities and roads and thoroughfares are still resonant with the Roman story of Britain. And then we were invaded or had come into our political midst, the Vikings, the Danes, and various people from the Anglo-Saxon world. If you think of Britain, in many ways, its first formation, certainly of England, rather than the Celtic races of Ireland, and Wales, and Scotland, but the English world in the early Middle Ages was Anglo-Saxon. Isn't it interesting that our first formative identity already has a hyphen in it, Anglo-Saxon? And I don't need to tell you where the concept of Saxony comes from. 1066 and all that, we are invaded, completely taken over by the French or the Normans, because in those days France was a broken up country as well. And until the mid-16th century, until the time of Mary Tudor, Britain also governed or had royal command of great swathes of France. And it was only when Calais was lost, I think in the early 1550s, that ceased. The 100 Years' War and the period thereafter, Britain and France, for good or ill, mostly for ill probably, were interlocked in terms of political unity. And of course, Britain, for good or ill, I would say for ill, was absolutely conjoined until the early 20th century with another great EU nation, Ireland. So in terms of our identity, our constitution, we are already very, very European. Then we look to the people who came to live in the UK over the centuries. Now, obviously, the primary experience of that in the late 20th century has been immigration from particularly South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and from the Afro-Caribbean, and all, of course, in the wake of empire. I'm not making I'm not making value judgment comments tonight. I'm simply talking about historical facts at the moment. But in fact, there has been an enormous history of European immigration into the UK, particularly since the 17th century. In the 17th century, when Louis XIV became particularly hostile to the Protestants of France, called the Huguenots in their thousands came to the UK and were welcomed there. They actually based themselves around what some of you will know as Brick Lane in the East End of London. And Brick Lane, of course, has been a refuge, if I can use that word, for people from South Asia as well in more recent times. And right through until the 20th century, Britain was incredibly accommodating of people from Europe. And if I may say, particularly during the First World War and the Second World War, when, of course, a number of European governments, including France, had their base in London during the period of Nazi takeover. And right up until the end of the 20th century, indeed, Britain, by being a member of the European Union, was welcoming and receptive to many European nationalities, most particularly people from Poland. And it was not long since the Polish minority in the UK was the largest UK minority, larger even than people from India or from Pakistan or Bangladesh. Let me talk about our capital city, London, which incidentally, recently, I haven't checked my facts of late, was the third largest French city in the world in terms of the number of people from France who live in London. It is, I believe, the most multicultural and international city in the world. One great way of measuring a country's multiculturalism is to measure the number of languages, first languages that are spoken there. And the first language spoken is, what language, they ask people, what language do you speak at the breakfast table with your family? What language do you speak at the breakfast table with your family? And in London, there are over 300 languages spoken at the breakfast table with families. And I think the nearest to that is New York, where it's 200 and lower 200s. London is a truly cosmopolitan capital. and incredibly accommodating to the diasporas of the world, including every European nation. Now, a great determinant of cultural relationship, the greatest determinant of cultural relationship, is language. And I want to reflect for a minute on the English language, which people stridently feel, and quite rightly, has become a world language for reasons of imperialism, and that is deeply, deeply disturbing, but nevertheless, there it is as a world language. And people assume that this is a monolithic, pure kind of language which has been imposed on the world. Far from it. And I am myself a student of literature, so I claim a little bit of knowledge here. The language, English, is actually a strong and great language in its linguistic content, primarily because it is, if I may use the word, a mongrel language. It is a language created out of other languages. And what are the languages it is created out of? Early Middle English, and before that, early medieval, and before that period, European languages. It is primarily a coming together of the Latinate languages of the Latin world and Southern Europe and France, and the Teutonic or Germanic languages of your part of the world. Those Teutonic or Germanic languages were powerful in northern Britain as a result of Danish and Germanic and Anglo-Saxon and Jute and Viking invasions. And the Latinate languages were powerful in the south of what is now the UK, primarily because of the Norman takeover in 1066. That melding together of two very different kinds of language have created a truly versatile, brilliant language. Fortunately, as it's been imposed on the world, it explains Shakespeare. And I am a Shakespeare student. I really believe that Shakespeare's greatness comes in many ways, but one primary one is that he could navigate a language which was created of many other languages, particularly North and Southern Europe. So language is a critical aspect of Britain being not only a fundamental part of Europe, but being created by our friends in Europe over many centuries. And the bilateral cultural relationship between Britain and Germany has been enormously powerful. I'll talk about modern times shortly, but in all kinds of ways. At the cultural level, at the artistic level, Britain and Germany have been talking from the same song sheet. When I talk about song sheet, I think of what was the most popular composer in Britain in the 19th century, Queen Victoria's favorite composer. It was Mendelssohn. Go back the other way to the 18th century, who was regarded by most great German literary figures, including Goethe, as the greatest writer who had ever lived? It was Shakespeare. And in fact, the German Shakespeare Society, which still exists to this day as a very great Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft, was founded on the belief, I've never quite understood it, that Shakespeare was a German who somehow found himself in the wrong place. So the affinities are extraordinary. And of course, the popular cultural affinities of today around media, around comedy, around television, around film, around football, around other sports are still extraordinarily rich between our two countries. Now, I want to turn to my own organisation just for a moment, because the British Council, which some of you know better than others, no doubt, is committed to this concept of cultural relations. And it believes that the cultural relationship between countries is more important actually than the political relationship between countries, or even the trading relationship between countries, because it draws on these deep legacies. And culture strikes to the heart of what matters most to people: their identities, their histories, their religions, their value systems, their concepts of family, their concepts of them and us, who belongs in my world and who doesn't. It's culture that, for instance, causes aspects of secession in the modern world, including in Europe. It's along cultural fracture lines that Scotland wants independence from the UK. It's along cultural and linguistic fracture lines that Catalonia wants independence, that Belgium might split up, that the Balkans determine who they want to be and who they don't want to be, and so on and so forth. Culture is a deeper consideration than politics. I really believe that. Nations are political creations on the whole, but cultures are much deeper and cross-national and within national than that. And they are far more determining of the way people feel and the way people behave. I think this is something that happened, to use that slightly, to use the cliche really, at 9/11. But what happened that day, 9/11, was that it was seen that one value system came into deep conflict with another value system in the world, based on religion, based on attitudes, based on behaviors. And people realized that this thing, culture, is not marginal. It's not this merely, if I can use that word for the moment, arts agenda. The culture, the way I like to see it, is the world is an ocean. And on the top, we see lots of frothy waves and constant movements, and that's politics. We see it, it's visible. Underneath are deep undertones, which are causing those waves, and that is culture. Now, the British Council, therefore, is engaged in cultural relations, and so are our great, great friends and an organisation I probably respect more than any comparable organisation in the world, the Goethe Institute. We are committed to cultural relations, languages, cultures, arts, civil society, education at all levels. And I just wanted to give a moment of history. The British Council was founded in 1934. Why was it founded in 1934? It was actually founded by the British government, even though we are now official but independent of government to a degree. We were founded in 1934 because the British government, in its wisdom, and it was wisdom then, said that people-to-people relations, culture, education, such things, should not be a potentially propagandic subset of our politics. At a time of totalitarianism across Europe and Russia, this agenda must be put at arm's length. It can be funded by government, it should not be managed by government in the same way, and it should not be trying to beat its wings to a short-term governmental political agenda. It has to really forge relationship between peoples, and that can only be done on that famous level playing field. That is still the foundation of the British Council. Even today, 86 years later, 7 years later, we are still an official organisation, the only official organisation that does culture and cultural relations from the UK. We don't have cultural departments in our embassies. We are still official. We are still non-governmental. We are set up under a royal charter. Our patron is the Majesty of the Queen, vice patron is the Prince of Wales, and we report to a board of trustees. Very similar to the Goethe Institute, which is the only cultural analogue, as I put it, that is similar to the British Council in this commitment to building relationships rather than simply showcasing and showing off our expertise. So we are all have to spend 2021 rebuilding, reasserting cultural relationships. There are already a number of terrific bilateral organizations between Germany and Britain, which are joining in this enterprise, not least yourselves, the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft, and I salute you. Your friends in the UK, the British-German Association, the UK-German Connection, which commits itself to young people in schools, the British Chambers of Commerce in Germany, which have done terrific work on that shorter-term agenda of sorting out trade relations and economics. But also, of course, Königswinter and Young Königswinter, a fantastic legacy there, but one which I know wants to relaunch itself into this new age. Two terrific new ambassadors, if I may say, in Germany and here with Jill Gallard in in Berlin who are utterly committed to the cultural relationship in very material terms, as much as they are to political and trade relations. And then we're all looking again at a dull old document, but which should be breathed new life, the 1958 Cultural Convention between Germany and Britain, signed by ministers in both countries that 62 years ago, which has been rather dormant, but which is still actually potentially active, and we must all look to a new cultural convention. The main thing we have to do, and certainly the British Council is committed to this, is rebuilding institutional relationships. And I don't mean that vaguely. We have got to look to whatever it is, this year 20 or 30, next year expanding it to 40 or 50, key institutional relationships which must say, despite EU exit, we're going to work together to bring our peoples and our professionals and our academics and our creative people increasingly together. In the arts, that's specifically internationally minded venues in both countries and festivals. It means, of course, universities and research institutes. It means school and youth organizations. And it means institutions committed to global issues. And by global issues, I particularly mean global issues with bilateral agendas like diversity, climate change, identity and religion, mobility. And these include the Stiftungen that perhaps have a bit of money to help with these things, plus the bilaterals like Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft, and plus the very biggest and most important cultural and educational organizations in Germany, which have the most powerful history of linkage with the UK, and which we are restoring. People like the Deutsch-Akademische Austauschdienst, the EFA, and the Goethe Institute. And there are already great linkages to build further. I just refer to one, and that's the alliance between Oxford University and 4 universities in Berlin. It's one of many, but it's a particularly strong one, and has managed to find for itself significant funding to ensure that the levels of research and academic engagement, there is real strength. The primary purpose for all of us is to restore for the relationship reputation, credibility, visibility, and a word we like a lot in the British Council, trust. And I acknowledge that in Germany in particular, the process of Brexit and then EU exit damaged trust, as trust can only be damaged amongst the greatest of friends. There was a sense of letdown, I won't use harder words, but I could do, by Britain leaving the EU. So the agenda must be to redeliver trust. And, you know, I used to be the director of the British Council in the USA for 4 years recently, and we used to spout on and on about the special relationship. And it had a lot of validity. But I see between Germany and Britain a much more valid and real and long-lasting and potential special relationship. I think it's a very special relationship, and we need to know that and get it back. Look, I'm speaking a lot of rhetoric, some of you might say, because this isn't going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, particularly this year. We have a lot of things to deal with in terms of rebuilding the relationship. We've got to put our money where our mouth is, and unfortunately, there's not much money. COVID is in itself a damaging problem for us all. COVID has seriously damaged the financial capabilities of many British organizations, including mine, the British Council. I honor Germany for having sustained many of its critical cultural organizations through COVID. You are exemplary, as in so many areas, in keeping head above water, including, for instance, the Goethe Institute through the Auswärtiges Amt. I respect that. But I won't pretend that Britain's funding for critical organizations, including my own, is not difficult. We also have whole new agendas around educational mobility, which we've got to help people find their way through. That going to study in the UK has become a more difficult agenda and a more costly one for many people. We have an exciting new program in the Turing scheme, which some of you will know about, which, as it were, replaces Erasmus+, but it doesn't replace Erasmus+ in entirely the way that our German friends would wish to see. So we have to help explore new opportunity in terms of higher education engagement with Turing Plus in some way. And in terms of the arts, I mean, a short-term agenda, of course, is the mobility of British and German artists to each other's countries, who love each other's countries so much that they're invited to every possible festival and every possible venue in normal times, is challenged by questions of work permits and visas and movement of freight and goods and so on. You know, I haven't got the detail in my head, but we're all helping work on getting those doors unlocked, because the will is that the cultural, including the artistic, and the popular entertainment relationship between Germany and Britain must be as back to normal as soon as possible. So this is why I argue that the cultural relationship in the broadest sense is much, much bigger than the implications of EU exit. And people sometimes ask me, I've been here a year now, what is my main ambition as director of the British Council in Germany? I'll tell you, it's very simple. I have all kinds of specific deliverables, to use that silly word we all use, but I have one ambition more than any other. That in a year's time, our friends who lead significant cultural and educational organizations in Germany will say, you remember Brexit? We thought it was going to cause chaos and we thought it was a real problem, but somehow it didn't matter. Because what really matters is our relationships with our peers in the UK. They went from strength to strength. That's what matters. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear a discussion rather than take Q&A, but either way, thank you, Rupert.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a really a great sort of pep talk for us all. Some people might wonder whether your ambition, which you voiced at the end, people saying, you remember Brexit? And so, you know, what was that sort of, you know, will actually come true. Because there are, of course, a few really, but I would immediately add that the British Council, of course, has a real track record of trying to sort of overcome the difficulties and challenges of Brexit since the referendum. There was this oops, how do I do this? This little booklet put out at the very height of the discussions and where everybody was loggerheads with each other. And British Council came along and said, look, we must look beyond that and try and look at the opportunities. So thank you very, very much. It's been very fascinating listening to you, and I think it's given us quite a lot of food for thought to sort of really think about, yes, is this true? And I would contend it is, that culture is deeper than politics, that the special relationship between UK and Germany is possibly deeper because it's cultural than the special relationship with the US. We were reminded that there has been a cultural convention in existence and in force since 1958. I didn't know that. So I suppose we have a task to revitalize that. But you've also said, yes, it can be done. And so that, I think, is what we should set about. Now, I think a number of people in the audience have already voiced some comments. And perhaps I'll take up one to start with from that says, what are you doing about the British press and their reflex German EU France bashing? Well, I don't suppose you can really do very much, but I'm sure you have a comment.
Well, it's probably more of a question for my friends in the communications department of the British Embassy. But I mean, of course, the tabloid press of the UK is famous, and more famous perhaps than some of the other press of the UK. And I would actually say that France-German bashing is not a feature of a particularly great newspaper, which has its 200th anniversary this year, The Guardian. I shouldn't be partial, but I mean, I think there is a great broadsheet that has always committed itself to the concept of Europe and to the concept of tolerance, the concept of engagement. I think the BBC, though theoretically impartial totally, is also always a voice for reaching out and a voice for tolerance and a voice for understanding. And so I think that we all have to deal, as you do with bills perhaps, with tabloid, to my mind, absurdities and tabloid arrogances and tabloid prejudices. But I think some of us believe that there are aspects of the British media which are older and stronger and wiser and kinder. And those are the ones that I hold to.
Yes, this leads straight on into another question. I just have to find it again. Yes, Elizabeth Gilbert says, thank you very much. What I find particularly worrying is that today is the first time I have even heard of the Turing scheme, although I work at an English department in Cologne. Could you give us some details? Does it envision support for student exchanges both ways?
Yes, I'm sorry that it's the first you heard of it. It has been fairly well projected. But if you look somewhere on the British Council website, maybe Ruth, you can put in my communications director, Ruth, could perhaps put in the comments line a way of finding out about it. You'll probably find Turing on the British Council website, as you will on the British Embassy website. Okay, so British Council, Britain left the Erasmus Plus program at the time of Brexit. I won't comment on that, but immediately the UK introduced a new scheme called the Turing scheme. It's Turing. It's based on the very great physicist and mathematician Sir Alan Turing, who some of you will have heard of, working in GCHQ Cheltenham in the early years, and who was greatly abused.
Not perhaps the most tactful name to select, but yeah. Well,
I think it's tactful in terms of diversity, in that he was greatly oppressed for his sexuality, and then came through a very great person, anyway, whatever Turing it is. And the Turing scheme offers enormous opportunity initially for UK students to go and study in many countries, not just Europe. It's now got a global program, which Erasmus wasn't quite in the same way. I will admit the primary issue for Germany, and indeed we organised British Council conversation the other day with the Minister for Higher Education in the UK, with the presidents of the GAAD, the presidents of the Hochschule Rektor Conference, and and other senior leaders in higher education, and at for instance, Universität Tübingen. The primary concern at the moment is that Turing does not yet, anyway, have quite the same reciprocal arrangements for Germans to go and study and research in the UK. We're all working on that. Let us see what happens. But that's where Turing is at the moment.
Okay, in the same vein.
And I think one of my colleagues has just put Turing website link into the comments. So
very good, very good. In the same vein, there's another comment here from Christoph Heil. He says, yes, this is all about keeping doors open. I could not agree more. How are we going to solve the problem of getting T5 visa for young people from Germany hoping to work as language assistants at schools in Britain? I am well aware, he says, of the British Council PAD procedure, but will you help to confer sponsor status on individual British schools in order to simplify matters and to keep existing cooperation between German universities and British schools going? Now, this is a real mouthful.
It is, and I'm not sure whether I'm perfectly positioned to answer it well. But all I can say is, and this isn't rhetoric, this is truth, that where student mobility is being, at the moment, including lectorships, like my friend describes there, is being affected by, at the moment, seemingly striking visa situations. We are working on it all the time. Remember, the British Council is not a part of the British government, as I've said before. So we have to negotiate and help and present situations and problems to government in the hope that things can be, in some ways, alleviated. I think there are capacity for student visas up to certain times. I think, if I'm right, and I may be wrong, apologies, but I think it's 90 days at the moment, in which there is still a fluency of mobility without the need for visas. But over 90 days, which is the sort of period of a term, it's an academic term, isn't it? It gets harder. I take that question very much. If it's in the comments, we may even specifically try to answer you, my friend, directly by asking a friend to send you. But all I can say is we're working on it. You know, since January that these questions of mobility and visas and work permits have all really sort of swamped people. And we know we have to work our way through them. And to a certain extent, it's the British Council itself lobbying our friends in the British government. We'll see where we can get.
Yeah. I have another question here, which is perhaps rather more political, and I don't know whether you're inclined to answer it. Do you think, like some S&D MEPs used to maintain, that it is also the fault of the Labour Party that it did not really avoid the exit? Well, that Brexit was not avoided.
Well, your inference, Rupert, is right. I can't comment on any scenario, nor can I imply that Brexit or not was right or wrong. We all have our personal views, but our personal views are relevant to our professional standing. Yeah. So I wouldn't comment on that, and I don't know it. No. What I do know is that we've inherited what EU exit has provided, and we're going to make everything as positive as possible. I'm sounding like a politician, I know, but I mean it.
Yeah. No, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Now, here's one from Volkmar Weiss from Dresden, who says, when you mentioned the authoritarian times in Europe and in Russia, you distinguished Europe from Russia. Why do you apply the often used British phrase of Britain not being part of Europe, which I do not agree to, also to Russia? Wow.
I don't quite understand that. I certainly wasn't trying to make any geographical distinctions there. And I think the British Council founded in 1934, it was as a riposte to totalitarianism, which manifests itself in many ways in many parts of the world there. And some people might say that the UK itself, particularly in imperial times, was not itself always averse to totalitarianism or wrongful behaviors, be that as it may. It was felt at that time that fascism, communism, Nazism, which in 1934 were all growing, were political means which would use culture in the broadest sense as a tool for propaganda and political propagation. And that the UK, I think wisely at that time, said, let's do it differently. Let's set up this separate organization. And it was set up under the then king as patron, George V. And its aim was to, as best it could, do people-to-people relationship building rather than government to government, potentially propagandic public diplomacy. If I could just say for a moment about the phrase public diplomacy, which people often think we do. We don't do public diplomacy because for this very same reason that I'm just talking about. If diplomacy is the government of one country trying to benignly influence the government of another country, then public diplomacy is the government of one country trying to influence the people of another country. And I think we're on a slippery slope there that works to propaganda. That's why we talk about cultural relations. That's why we feel it has to be done at arm's length or independently, as Germany does through the Goethe Institute.
Let me just put one in. One thought that sort of troubles me a bit is how will Europe be able to go on making the best use of the connections that the UK has to, well, all over the world, really. It's part of Britain's colonial past, if you like. But if we want to really know something about India or Pakistan and a lot of other countries, the sources are predominantly British sources. If we want to listen to truly international news, it's the BBC we turn to, and so on and so forth. And well, the BBC obviously will go on as long as they don't close it down. But how are we going to really continue to make the best use of it? I feel we're going to lose a bit on that one, but perhaps you're more optimistic than I am.
Sorry, unmute. Well, speaking as someone who's lived about 12 years in South Asia, I don't accept that understanding of South Asia or Indian history or Indian contemporaneity in any way needs to come through, British prism, though there are some very great British historians, and I believe honest and capable historians of.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to understand all countries of the world through their own historians and through their own commentators. And I think myself, this is sometimes a challenge for me to say in relation to my government, but I think there's still an enormous amount of cultural work to do on Britain's understanding of its own imperial and post-imperial and post-colonial past. And there's a hell of a lot of decolonisation still to do in all parts, many parts of British attitude to the world. And I would have my wrist slapped by a number of contemporary British politicians, but I'm going to say that I think it's probably the biggest cultural agenda for the UK in the wider world. And I take my hat off to the Goethe Institute there, which over 72 years has worked at an understanding, a humble understanding of what happened in the 1940s in Germany, to actually help reposition Germany in the world as having gone from the most pariah nation in the world, which it was in 1945, to perhaps the nation in 2021 that is most respected for its values, its tolerance, its understanding, and its commitment to good international cause. That's been an extraordinary experience, and certainly at the British Council, I would like to follow a similar kind of experience as the Goethe Institute. Vis-a-vis the BBC, can't particularly comment, but it was very interesting when I spoke about the foundation of the British Council. It was at a similar time that the British government founded, helped fund the start of the BBC World Service radio, and it was from the start fully funded by the British Foreign Office, but with total editorial independence. And I believe it was, and that was an extraordinary first move. It was followed by other organizations later on, much down the line, like Deutsche Welle and Voice of America, though I have my views on Voice of America, so how quite independent. Nevertheless, the BBC has a hell of a lot of problems and difficulties and challenges and so on. I'm still very proud of it myself.
Right. Now I have a very specific comment here. Many people in Germany are completely unaware that Britain has a second language, which is only very distantly related to English, and that is Welsh. What are you going to do to promote Welsh culture?
Well, it has a number of the UK. I spoke of it as a mongrel nation. I hope nobody's too offended by that phrase, but I believe it and I love it. And it has a number of languages in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, Celtic languages, Gaelic, and of course it has the great Welsh language. What are we going to do? Well, we did something last month. The British Council for over 30 years has run something called the British Council Literature Seminar in different parts of Germany. And last month we ran it. Of course, it was virtual more than ever, but the great advantage of that was far more people joined us than usual. and we entirely dedicated it to Welsh literature. And it took place over 3 days, and much or all of it was bilingual in its presentation. Many of the writers we featured were primary writers in Welsh rather than in English. And it was an absolute championing of the bilateralism and the multiculturalism of modern Wales. And incidentally, next year we're looking to Northern Ireland. I'm not sure how bilingual that might be, but if it needs to be, we will certainly happily make it so. So we are very committed. When you talk about cultural relations, you're talking about the granular nature of cultures. It's not just cultures that spread beyond national borders, but all the many cultures within a country. And in Germany, a comparatively new political construct for 150 years, then it's different cultures and it's different small languages and so on, or variations on the main language are critical to the cultural relationship within Germany. So the UK, the British Council is totally committed to the cultural granularity, including languages, of modern Britain.
Right, thank you very much. Now, I can't see any further questions. There's been a great interest in this whole issue of exchanges and schools and things, but I think you've pretty well answered most of them. But I think what would remain as a sort of takeaway from this event is that it is on a lot of people's minds in this country, this whole issue of being able to send young people, send students over to the UK and to receive students from the UK, young people from the UK here, over here. I think that is definitely one of the challenges to work on. I'm just looking at the sheet. I can't see any further comments and questions that we haven't touched upon. You said at some point the biggest challenge of all is to redeliver trust. This, of course, resonates with a lot of people, with a lot of other issues as well. We are in a state where everybody seems not to trust anybody else. In my own field of work, this trust issue has come up to about number one on the list of priorities. So, would you have any sort of bit of advice or bit of yes, anything? How should we go about it? What we need to do to redeliver trust?
Well, you know, trust, it's a sort of fanciful word, isn't it? But it's actually the single biggest thing the British Council tries to engender worldwide. And you engender it through relationships, not just through partnerships. People talk about partnerships and relationships as if they're the same thing. We all work through projects and activities which involve partnership, mutuality, reciprocation. But partnerships are, you know, they tend to have an MOU, they tend to be time bound. You're going to have a partnership for 3 years, you're going to deliver some things together, you're going to evaluate it together, you've got a certain amount of funding, and then you move on. Relationships are a very different thing. Relationships are in terms of long term. And this is where the British Council is strong, and is very proud that it's existed in Germany since 1958 and in the wider world since 1934, and we're in 120 countries or whatever it is. And we are developing relationships, and you don't develop relationships overnight. They depend on legacy, constant maturity, and they depend on trust. I ask people to think about these professional and institutional relationships in the same way as they think about their personal, family, or romantic relationships. You don't have an MOU for your relationship with your spouse or your friend. You agreed time limit in which it's going to work itself out, and a bit of money that you can put to it. Your relationship, you go in things. You go in for it to last forever, and you go in to be changed by it as much as you want to change the other person. People want to, through the mutuality they get in a relationship, to be wonderfully exhilarated, elevated, and changed. And the thing that you're generating between yourselves is trust, such that when the politics go sour, when the surface tension goes wrong, fundamentally people trust each other. And I happen to believe at the moment that despite everything that's being said, the academics and the researchers and the intellectuals and the cultural people of Britain and Germany fundamentally still trust each other. They know that this EU exit has not been a turning away, and that everybody is struggling to get the dynamics and the logistics back. And the British Council's cultural agenda has managed to survive in countries where the political agenda has collapsed. We have cultural and educational work going on today in North Korea, in Afghanistan, where I was myself, in Iraq, in Burma. When the politics goes wrong, the long-standing trust that comes from the cultural relationship is often what keeps people's head above water and believing in each other. It's about friendship. Friendship is not a silly word. Friendship in the modern world is a critical word. And if people can have authentic and genuine friendship between peoples of nations, there's some hope for the world.
Thank you. This is a really rousing way to end this event. And of course, you're absolutely right. I think I can say on behalf of the board and members of the British Society that anything we can do to help you on this, in this sort of uphill battle, we are certainly at your complete disposal to do and to help. And I hope we will be in touch on various occasions, including, of course, being in touch face to face, much as we enjoy being able to do things online at the moment. So thank you very, very much again. It's been really interesting. It's been really good, wonderful to listen to you. And yes, unfortunately, we can't have dinner together afterwards, but that, as I said earlier, we will try and do on another occasion.
I will hold you to that, Peter.
Yeah. And to all of you who have listened in, thank you for listening in. Yes, come back to our next events, which will follow in due course. Thank you and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Paul.